To open the conference, our first speaker is Marcel van der Linden from the International Institute for Social History, Amsterdam, speaking on labour, class and labour history since 1980. Marcel.
So. Thank you. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here, and I didn't know when I prepared my talk that I would sit and speak also to the president and his wife, which is a special honor, of course. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to attend this 50th anniversary of the Irish Labour History Society, which is truly a big achievement. Irish labour history has undergone a fantastic development in the last half century. At least that is the impression that I have as an outsider. Irish academia has long ignored labour, as we know. About 20 years ago, Emmett O'Connor observed that, as he said, not a single person was employed as a labour historian in any college or research centre in Ireland. The founding of the Labour History Society in 1973 changed that, and the publication of the journals since 1975, of course, has contributed significantly to the fact that the history of work and workers has nevertheless become a vibrant research area. Both the association and the journal have clearly been the main forum for much of the ongoing work on Irish labour history. Looking back, the establishment of the ILHS was part of a longer-running international trend. Already in 1959, the Austrian Verein für Geschichte der Arbeiterbewegung, so Association for Labour Movement History, was founded. Britain, who usually they think that they are the first, but they are the second, came next in 1960 with the Society for the Study of Labour History. And in 1961, inspired by this, an organization was also established in Australia. After the the acronym is difficult for me, the Gaeltacht, founded in 2017. You see some of those associations. Although the ILHS was part of a wider pattern in that sense, it was different from most other organizations from the start. Not only because of the affiliation of unions and the participation of non-academic members, but also because of the break with methodological nationalism. Let me briefly explain what I mean by that. Traditionally, labour historians reconstructed the history of the working classes and movements in, for instance, Germany, France, or Great Britain as separate developments. But it was obvious from the outset that such an approach would not work for Ireland. Its past as a colony made it impossible to study its own history in isolation. The great influence of the British Empire and the enormous role of international migration made it clear that Irish labour history could always only be understood in a transnational context. Already the first issue of Southar contained an article by the late David Doyle about the Irish and US labour. And after that, a stream of articles and books on labour history have appeared, all of which deal with transnational aspects. Irish labour historians never seem to have fallen victim to methodological nationalism to the same extent as their colleagues from many other countries. In that sense, you were an implicit vanguard. The volume of literature on the Irish diaspora, as it has developed especially since the 1960s, is overwhelming, and the quality is often impressive, while the historiography of the working class inside Ireland has also boomed. We now have a huge but still somewhat disparate corpus of literature concerning the history of workers in Ireland and across the globe. This makes it possible to ask more far-reaching questions about international contrasts and cross-border interactions. The integration of the available historical material is a wonderful challenge, and in recent years, first steps in this direction have already been made. In the following, I would like to combine some insights from the available literature to highlight one important aspect of the global Irish class formation in one specific period, collective action in the years from the 1790s to the 1920s. Everything that follows is no more than a modest exploration of a possible research direction made by a global labor historian who knows nothing about the Irish past. A basic assumption of global labor history is, that is the labor history that is developed by these different associations of whom we saw a few just on the screen. A basic assumption of global labor history is that the history of capitalist labor must encompass all forms of physically or economically coerced commodification of labor power, plus all labor which creates such commodified labor or regenerates it, that is parental labor, care labor, household labor, and subsistence labor. While taking all these different forms of labor into account, we should use households or families as the basic unit of analysis rather than individuals. Because most households combine multiple resources of income in ever-changing ways. In addition to wage labor, they also perform subsistence activities, almost always, are frequently through debts or otherwise dependent on higher placed people, and so on. These considerations fit, I think, in well with the diverse past of the Irish working class, which included wage earners, sharecroppers, housewives and domestics, but also indentured and convict laborers and even slaves. I limit myself here to the forms of collective action that Irish workers deployed over time. What was the relationship between developments in Ireland itself and abroad? What interactions have taken place and what changes have these interactions undergone over time? Fundamental to the analysis of Irish struggle seems to be the specific culture of resistance that arose in response to English oppression and exploitation. The anthropologist James Scott has recalled that in many parts of the world, the notion Irish democracy was a term used to describe what he called the silent, dogged resistance, withdrawal, and truculence of millions of ordinary people. In 1836, an English employer summarized this notion by declaring before a parliamentary commission the following: where there is discontent or a disposition to combine or turn out among the work people, the Irish are the leaders. They are the most difficult to reason with and convinced on the subject of wages and regulations in the factories. A condemning judgment. Irish migrants were feared all over the British Empire, especially if they were numerous. When the arrival of 40 Irish families was announced for Somerset County in Maryland, in the USA, in 1681, the suspicion soon arose, I quote, that 40 families will prove in the end to be 40,000 to cut the throats of the Protestants. In the English West Indies, Irish servants, as a historian writes, were cordially hated by their English masters. In New York City, in the early 20th century, people spoke of Irish rain, which meant a shower of bricks from tenement rooftops onto the heads of scabs and their police protectors. And it rains a lot in Ireland, I noticed. The unruliness of the Irish was so notorious that other difficult ethnic groups were identified with it. For example, when immigrants from Spanish Galicia were imported into Cuba after 1848, they became rebellious almost immediately and soon were known as the Spanish Irishmen. The Irish lower classes, familiar as they were with systematic oppression, developed forms of organized resistance of their own. In analyzing this, we can make use of an interesting idea of the historical sociologist Charles Tilley. Participants in collective action, he wrote, called claimants, resemble actors. They have a limited repertoire, for instance, petitions, demonstrations, etc., which they perform whenever they wish to present their claims collectively to the authorities or to opponents. So there are always certain repertoires of contention comprising several performances each. Performances and repertoires evolve through confrontations with the adversary, the object of the claims. There is continuous interaction between the authorities and the claimants. Assemblies are prohibited, consultation occurs, demands are presented, limits are explored. A repertoire is always the outcome of bargaining. It is plastic and it changes over time. The Irish countryside developed its own repertoire of contention, especially from the mid-18th century, when output, income, and consumption increased, but the underlying commercialization of agriculture led, among other things, to higher rents, shorter leases, and prohibitions against subletting, and so tensions between landlords and tenants increased. It was under these circumstances that the famous secret societies such as the White Boys, Levelers, Defenders, Break of Day Boys emerged that defended the traditional moral economy. They are community-based organizations united by oath, applied threats, destruction of property, torture, beatings, and even rape and homicide to achieve their ends. They formed, in the words of historian Peter Way, in effect, primitive syndicalist organizations. It is probable that especially young men were attracted to secret societies, although this may in part also be misleading propaganda by the opponents. The White Boys, Ribbon Men, etc., were completely dominated by men. The typically Irish repertoire of contention was therefore clearly masculine. Whether women in Ireland have also developed a repertoire of contention of their own at the same time will have to be further researched. During emigration, the weapon of the secret organization was taken along and adapted to the new circumstances. For example, where more than 400 rebels of 1798 were deported to New South Wales, they almost immediately caused great, often well-organized unrest. A quote from a report. There were disturbances throughout 1800. In February, a seditious gathering was broken up in Sydney, and in May, another plot was reported. In September and October, further conspiracies were investigated, and supposed participants flogged or sent to Norfolk Island. In December, a plot on Norfolk Island was forestalled by the execution of 2 of its leaders. End of quote. So as soon as these Irish arrived in Australia, they caused havoc. In the United States, Irish secret societies made their mark from the first decades of the 19th century. The workers who built the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal between 1834 and 1840 were mostly Irish. They banded, says the report, together and sought to establish a certain amount of control over the workplace and relations with their bosses. The Irish secret society acted as their model for mobilization. Neither formally structured nor unchanging, organizations lay dormant, then mobilized for specific grievances. They caused at least 10 significant disturbances and virtually continuous labor unrest, necessitating the state militia to be called out 5 times and federal troops once. Much more famous or infamous have become the Molly Maguires, who were at the origin of what has been called America's first labor war. They made their appearance in Pennsylvania's coal region from the late 1850s. The miners affiliated with the Molly Maguires, they were largely from north central and northwestern Ireland, especially the county of Donegal. In particular, they used collective violence against mine owners and superintendents, policemen, and municipal officials, but also against workers of other ethnic backgrounds, especially the skilled British miners. A late expression of Irish democracy could be observed in South Africa in the 1880s, were a gang of Irish bandits, says a report, ex-navvies in an Irish brigade and under a Captain Moonlight, terrorized the eastern Transvaal and parts of Portuguese Mozambique. Now, over time, the classical Irish repertoire of contention gave way to the modern trade union struggle. That was an important change in several ways. The historian Kevin Kenny commented on the Molly Maguires, I quote him, "Both modes of organization, the trade union and the violent secret society, tried to improve conditions of life and labor in the coal region. But the strategy of the trade union was indirect, gradual, peaceful, and systematically organized across the entire coal region, while that of the Molly Maguires was direct, violent, sporadic, and confined to specific localities. Trade unionism was a model of labor organization produced by and uniquely adapted to the prevailing social and economic conditions in 19th century Britain and Pennsylvania. Molly Maguireism, by contrast, embodied a form of protest derived in its essentials from a specific part of the Irish countryside." Gradually, the second repertoire of contention took shape in the form of local and small friendly societies and trade unions based on them. This is quite familiar, I think. But in the first half of the 19th century, the standard repertoire, consisting of petitions, strikes, etc., was still regularly supplemented with forms of violence. Initially, the differences between the old and the new repertoire were thus limited. In addition to the early trade unions, unskilled urban workers in some cases organized quasi-secret brotherhoods that could exercise a certain control over the local labor market. Usually, as Emmett O'Connor says, women lay beyond the ambit of labor organization. For a long time, perhaps until the 1830s, I'm not sure, the repertoires of contention coexisted. And it is also possible that they sometimes overlapped, for example, when members of secret societies became active in cities and joined labor organizations. Irish workers all over the world became involved in unions during the 19th century. As known, in Ireland itself, the influence of English and Scottish unions increased over time. This influence was, of course, promoted by the growing migration from Ireland, initially mainly as seasonal harvest migration. According to the census of 1841, over 57,000 migrants crossed to Britain from Irish ports each year. This circular migration brought, in the words of J.H. Johnson, increased familiarity with conditions elsewhere and disturbed the traditional way of life in the source areas, especially when seasonal harvest work in England was gradually converted into semi-permanent, a later permanent migration, and shifted to non-agricultural work. A real breakthrough of the Irish trade union movement, of course, did not take place until late in the 19th century, as in most countries in Europe, by the way, when unskilled workers also organized themselves and female wage earners began to stir more vigorously. All this eventually resulting in the founding of the ITUC in 1894, the IGTWU in 1909, and the Labour Party in 1912. You all know this much better than I do. But even more important for my subject is that Irish involvement also grew in trade unions abroad. This seems to have happened first in England and Scotland. It is plausible that men who had already done factory work in Ireland were pioneers in this area because they had already some experience. Take the case of Irish-born John Doherty. Doherty started work, I quote from a description, in Irish cotton workshops around 1808 at the age of 10. By 1816, now 18, he had become a cotton spinner in Lame, north of Belfast. Doherty emigrated to Manchester, England, that year. In Lancashire, he soon plunged into local struggles with the cotton masters. In 1819, Doherty went to prison for 2 years, convicted of helping start an 1818 strike by the Manchester Spinners Union. By 1830, he had emerged as a nationally visible labor leader, continuing to organize major strikes in Manchester and to initiate such projects as the Grand General Union of Operative Cotton Spinners for the entire United Kingdom and the Multi-Trade National Association for the Protection of Labor. End of quote. The Irish also played a powerful role in the Chartist movement in England in the years 1838, 1857, in which Fergus O'Connor was a prominent actor. When Irish workers subsequently migrated from Britain to other countries, they took with them the acquired contentious culture and action repertoires and often integrated these into the foreign repertoire of contention. The US historian Timothy Meagher concluded, I quote, "Many important Irish-American labor leaders, Philip Murray and John Brophy, among others, in the modern era, and John Siney and Joseph MacDonald in the 19th century, came to America through Britain and gained experience with unions before they arrived here in the US. Naturally, these kinds of transcontinental learning processes also occurred at the local and rank-and-file level. For example, in the 1860s to 1880s, thousands of Irish arrived in Fall River, Massachusetts. These immigrants had migrated from Ireland to the textile mills of Lancashire, where they were thoroughly apprenticed in the English trade union movement and class consciousness. With the English, they then left Lancashire for Fall River because of blacklisting strikes or depressions in the textile towns of Oldham, Blackburn, or Manchester. Not only the moderate unions managed to find support among Irish migrants, but also the more radical ones. A prime example are the industrial workers of the world. Historian Peter Cole mentioned a long history of Irish and Irish-American radicalism which existed alongside the more conservative racist traditions of other Irish Americans. And he pointed out that numerous Irish Americans became leaders in the IWW, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn being the most famous. Similarly, Irish labor leaders and revolutionaries, namely James Connolly and Jim Larkin, were drawn to the IWW when they lived and traveled in the United States. Perhaps less spectacular but effective was the resistance of Irish domestic servants in the United States, who applied an element of the second repertoire in their own situation. When toward the end of the 19th century, maids increasingly became live-out rather than live-in household employees, that is, they were no longer locked up in middle-class homes, their personal autonomy increased and they were able to reconnect with the Irish community. In addition, other jobs became available, especially in industry. Aware of this, many maids began to leave their service jobs in the early 20th century, claiming that they would find shorter hours, greater individual freedom, and more time for leisure in other lines of work. Such resistance, combined with the influence of emerging social reform movements from middle-class circles, led to a certain improvement in working conditions. You see a caricature with a servant presenting a list of demands. In Australia, Irish involvement in the emerging trade union movement was high. Some workers brought the skills and experience necessary to organize labor. By 1860, in Victoria, they had introduced craft societies, so trade unions, won an 8-hour working day and established the Trades Hall. When around the turn of the century, labor parties were founded, relatively many Catholic Irish people joined, as was also evident from their support in the 1910 elections. An entirely new situation, of course, arose during the Great War and its aftermath. The many sensational events of that period were accompanied by important but often temporary adjustments and expansions of the repertoire. I'm not only referring to the Easter Rising in 1916, of course, but also to the worksite occupations and the council movements in Limerick and elsewhere, partly inspired by the Russian Revolution. Most remarkable from an international comparative perspective was the role of the newly established Irish Republican Army. This was, of course, given the participation of petty bourgeois and businessmen, not a homogeneous class organization, but nevertheless consisted very predominantly of poor working men and played an important role in the worker struggle, if only by weakening state power and thus facilitating social protest. The IRA can perhaps be seen as an organization that modernized the first repertoire of contention by building a nationwide paramilitary structure. The repertoire developed by the IRA inspired resistance movements in other parts of the world. British India is probably the prime example of this. In Bengal, after the First World War, Ireland became the most important model for physical force nationalists. From 1926, a secret section of the Labour Swaraj Party decided to prepare an armed struggle along Sinn Féin lines in India. Around 1930, an Indian Republican Army arose from this. Acronym is, of course, the same, IRA, following the explicit example of the IRA. It apparently began each meeting with a reading of the Easter Uprising Manifesto. It sounds a bit odd, but okay. In the night of 18 April 1930, the Bengal IRA organized an armory raid in the port city of Chittagong, in which more than 60 revolutionaries, armed with revolvers and pistols, captured and set fire to police and auxiliary force armories and seized arms and ammunition, while others destroyed rail and telegraph communications. The raid created a boom in recruitment for revolutionary organizations and sparked British fears of similar raids elsewhere. In the years 1916-1923, expressions of solidarity with the Irish freedom struggle were integrated into the repertoire of contention of several foreign labor movements. For instance, in 1919, a rally of 8,000 Polish-American workers in the Chicago stockyards voted unanimously to demand the recognition of the Irish Republic. At another Chicago meeting, an African-American local of the Amalgamated Meat Cutters voiced support for the cause of Ireland, despite the long and bitter history of racist conflict between Irish and black workers in that city. An even better example was the participation of New York's African-American dock workers in the 1920 McSweeney strike. Prodded partly by the personal intervention of the African-American nationalist leader Marcus Garvey, black dockers joined the strike on the first day and continued to support it for the duration. Also elsewhere, in Argentina, Australia, Catalonia, England, Finland, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Quebec, Scotland, and South Africa, the Irish uprising had a clear impact. Now, this brings me to my conclusions. The globalization process of the last half-century has made it clear that the national state is not an appropriate geographical unit for class analysis. Historians of migration have pointed this out for some time, arguing that we have many excellent studies, for instance, of Irish immigrants within individual nation states, but little sense of the migration as a unified whole. My previous remarks underline the need for a holistic approach. The struggle of the Irish working class should not be seen in isolation, but in a much broader transcontinental context that includes not only the diaspora, but also segments of the lower classes of different ethnic backgrounds. What I have argued here needs a much more thorough elaboration, though. First, repertoires of contention are only a very small part of class analysis, obviously. Naturally, the analysis of collective action cannot be reduced to contentious repertoires. Moreover, a real study of class formation requires that we also do justice to the deeper aspects, in particular the structure of capitalist economic development, the social organization of society lived by actual people in real social formations, and classes as formed groups sharing dispositions. Enda Delaney was justified in pointing out that, and I quote, "A transnational history of class would examine both the diaspora and the Irish at home, and most importantly, develop sophisticated and theoretically informed models that look at the evolution of class consciousness, tensions between and across social classes, the language of class, barriers to upward social mobility, patterns of consumption, and gendered notions of what it meant to be middle or working class." End of quote. Second point, my one-sided focus on contentious behavior may give the wrong impression that all Irish workers exhibited protest behavior, and that protest was always from the left. Sometimes it was the other way around. In early 20th century New York City, for instance, the Irish were what is called the missing factor in the socialist movement. They made up fewer than 1% of enrolled socialists in 1915, of party recruits between 1908 and 1912, and of party members in 1904. And although they were often victims of racism themselves, Irish workers could naturally be racists too. Thirdly, the term diaspora is somewhat misleading. Freya Anthias has pointed out that it deploys a notion of ethnicity which privileges the point of origin in constructing identity and solidarity, and it thus fails to examine trans-ethnic commonalities and relations. A diaspora is only part of the story. For some time, 2, 3, or 4 generations, Irish immigrants can, of course, maintain an ethnic enclave. The ways in which that happens can vary widely, from direct intervention by a Catholic pastor who separates his flock from other ethnic groups as much as possible, as was the case in Argentina, to the formation of a large enclave, as happened in the mining town of Batte in the northern Rocky Mountains, where the large majority were from Castletown beer. I don't know if it's pronounced well. Okay, good. In any case, after some time, a gradual acculturation of immigrants and their socialization in working class environments and contexts occurs. How far this acculturation can go is illustrated by the development in Jamaica, where Irish indentured laborers have gradually been absorbed into the local, predominantly black population, in which Irish surnames now appear regularly. On Barbados, Irish servants mixed with English people of similar social status lost their distinctive Irish language, accent, and Catholicism and became poor whites. The many descendants of white Irish slave relationships were certainly unaware, says an historian, of any sense of belonging to the Irish nation. The dilution of ethnic identity makes it even more important for historians to integrate Irish class formation into a broader multi-ethnic analysis. This brings me to the final point. Such integrated analysis requires in-depth knowledge of different cultures and languages. In exceptional cases, one individual is able to do this, but is really exceptional. And as the body of knowledge grows, this will become increasingly rare. Therefore, it is more and more necessary to see historiography as the teamwork of researchers worldwide. And here, I think, lies an important future task for the Irish Labour History Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. We have a few minutes left in this session, so I'll ask for up to 3 questions, and let's try and make them brief if possible. Any hands?
Everybody agrees.
No questions?
Yeah, there's a hand there.
Okay. Seamus Moriarty. No.
Thanks very much for the talk, Marcel. You were a very positive account of the Irish contribution to the left and whatever, you know, but certainly shouldn't be recognised. There was a strong, in the 1930s, early 20th century, of the poor white element within the Irish working class, who are often the most bitterly anti-black members of the community, and that shouldn't be accepted as a reality, unfortunately.
Questions? The middle on the right. Name?
Brian Sutherland. What role did the Navy play in the trade unions? Did they have their own, or were they just sort of freelancing? And
Okay. One last question. Focal Scara. Francis Devine, Honorary President.
You are streamed, so you have to be on the mic.
Mike.
First of all, for anybody that wants to follow up Marcel's essay, it's the opening essay in the celebration essays, so it's well worth considering. And the only other thing to say is when he mentioned the Black Irish in the West Indies, it took me back, Michael D., to the Riach programme where you brought that to our attention. So I think that's a nice bookend to the President's attendance today.
So, the racism of Irish workers is well known. It's not, and I mentioned it in my talk, I think. So that is not I think a fundamental difference that we have. I had no pen, so I could not make any notes. But the question you asked about, what was it again? Navies. Navies. As far as I know, the navies were not at that time organized in unions. So they probably had some informal organizations, or they were part of a secret society that they had established there. So I don't know. This needs more research, but this is true for many of the things that I said. Okay.
Any final question?
For the rest, you all agree with me, yeah? Okay, good.
Okay. Dr. On.
I think it's worth investigating in future research the relationship of religion and the very consistent abuse, if you like, of the potential of class, how it gets lost. For example, we're going to, during these excellent set of papers that are going to be given over the next couple of days, we'll have discussion on the League of Nations and joining the League of Nations. But some of the contemporary accounts are saying how welcome Ireland's membership of the League of Nations is, because it's going to be the most militant Catholic opposition to communism, which is perceived as a great threat. Again, I think that in relation to the hidden transcripts of, if one was to use James Scott's model and all of the rest of it, is the tension between, if you like, how, if you like, consciousness of class is defeated again and again by a concept of nationalism that is described as effective because it's an effective, militant, necessary opposition to imperialism. As somebody trying to deal with issues of memory, I have to say finally, it is that what threw the greatest wrath on me from, it was an article I wrote in The Guardian critiquing imperialism. But in the case of the attack on imperialism was blunted very often by narrow nationalist and denominational religist impediments to the rightful class consciousness, in my view. It's a wonderful paper, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I couldn't agree more with what you said. I think this is really a big desideratum for labor history, to really focus on these differences and how they paralyze partly the movement. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank Marcel for an energetic discourse in relation to this particular period. I'd particularly like to thank Uachtaráin Airden and Patroon of the Irish Labour History Society for engaging in this discussion, and to thank him for being here at the opening of the conference. I'll ask the people here now to show their appreciation to Marcel van der Linden.